In a remote stretch of the Louisiana Bayou, where the moss-draped cypress trees cast long shadows across the murky waters and the sounds of civilization faded into the symphony of nature, something extraordinary was unfolding. A pack of 5 red wolves had gathered around a weakened horse, forming a silent circle in the clearing of Cypress Haven Ranch. They didn't attack. They didn't flee. They simply remained, as if standing vigil over something greater than life itself. No one knew how they had arrived there or what motivated such behavior. But in this unlikely scene began one of the most moving stories ever documented in the American South. Cypress Haven Ranch, nestled between flooded marshlands and dense forests, had belonged to the Mitchell family for over a century. Under the key, watchful eye of its caretaker, a humble and respected man named Earl Jackson, the property sheltered not only cattle and crops, but also a rich and largely undisturbed wildlife. Earl had spent more than 3 decades caring for this land, understanding its rhythms and respecting its wild inhabitants. The red wolves were known to cross the fields at dawn, feeding on native berries and small rodents. "Leave them be," Earl would often tell the young ranch hands. "They help more than they harm." That August, the dry heat preceded the autumn rains, and the vegetation showed signs of water stress. It was against this backdrop that the wolves began to act unusually. Led by the oldest of the group, a dark-furred male known among local biologists as Rusty, they followed the trail of something unusual. What they found would surprise even the most skeptical observers. Among the tufts of sawgrass and dried palmettos lay a horse of impressive stature, with golden coat and an almost white mane, motionless, with wounds on its flanks and half-open eyes. Clearly domesticated, yet alone amidst the wilderness. As the wolves approached, they showed no aggression. Rusty sniffed the air, gave a short howl, and sat down before the animal. The others followed, adopting a posture of vigilance rather than hunting. In the days that followed, images captured by monitoring cameras installed by researchers from Louisiana State University revealed inexplicable behaviors. The wolves brought small prey, fruits, and roots to the horse. They slept close to it, warming it during the cold nights, and when the rain finally fell, they guided it to a safe elevation away from the sudden flood. The news spread quickly through academic corridors. Dr. Melissa Thompson, a specialist in animal behavior, was among the first to investigate in person. With her attentive demeanor and keen eye, Melissa hesitated to believe the reports. "Predators don't adopt prey," she said, reviewing the videos at the base set up at the ranch, but the images left no doubt. Meanwhile, Earl, curious and concerned, returned to the sighting location. He saw the scene with his own eyes, the horse, now steadier on its legs, walking slowly escorted by the wolves as if they were its protectors. Shocked, he returned to the ranch house and shared what he had witnessed with Melissa, who decided to document every moment. Touching scenes began to emerge, the horse sharing space with the wolves allowing its approach as if it were a member of the pack. No sign of hostility, only complicity. Dr. Thompson then published a preliminary article on the university's academic platform, drawing attention to the phenomenon. The response was immediate. Journalists, researchers, and curious people from across the country began to mobilize. One of the first to arrive was reporter James Miller of Bayou Network News. A native of Lafayette, James knew the ecosystem like few others and immediately recognized the value of this story. In agreement with Melissa, he discreetly filmed the interactions, avoiding interference. The first report, titled The Bayou Covenant, went viral. While the images circulated throughout the country, something deeper was happening. In New Orleans, a silver-haired woman watched the report with rapt attention. Upon seeing the horse, she trembled. A detail on its right hind leg, a crescent-shaped scar, awakened memories she thought were lost. That mark could only belong to Aurora, the horse she had lost more than 15 years ago during the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. Driven by an inexplicable certainty, she boarded a bus the following morning. Alone, she faced more than 200 miles of road to reach Cypress Haven Ranch. When she arrived at the small town of Whisper Creek, she was greeted by Melissa, who had been previously notified by a phone call from the woman's grandson. Though concerned, he understood his grandmother's urgency. Margaret Williams had spent her entire life in southern Louisiana. Born to a family of teachers, she had dedicated her youth to rehabilitating injured wildlife before opening a small equestrian center just outside New Orleans. Aurora had been her pride. And Joy, a magnificent palomino with intelligence that seemed almost human. During the chaos of the hurricane, amid evacuation efforts, Aurora had bolted from her trailer, frightened by the howling winds. Despite extensive searches in the aftermath, Margaret had eventually been forced to accept that her beloved horse was gone forever. Yet here she was, possibly alive, having survived against all odds. The next afternoon, guided by Melissa and Earl, the elderly woman approached the clearing, where the group had last been seen. With slow but firm steps, she crossed the field until she spotted the golden silhouette among the bushes. The wolves immediately went on alert but did not attack. They watched. The horse raised its head, sensing a familiar presence. The air seemed to still, the bayou holding its breath in anticipation. Even the endless chorus of cicadas and frogs momentarily ceased, as if nature itself recognized the significance of this moment. Margaret stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small red apple, Aurora's favorite treat from all those years ago. "It can't be," whispered Melissa, watching the scene unfold from a respectful distance. "After all this time." Earl simply nodded, too moved to speak. There was something almost sacred about the reunion unfolding before them. The horse took a tentative step forward, then another. Its nostrils flared, catching a scent from the distant past. Margaret remained still, allowing the animal to make its choice. Rusty, the lead wolf, sat watching, as if understanding the magnitude of what was happening. His pack followed suit, creating a semicircle of silent witnesses. When the horse finally stood before Margaret, time seemed to melt away. The years of separation dissolved in an instant of recognition. Margaret extended her hand, the apple resting on her palm. "Aurora," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of bayou water against the cypress knees. "My beautiful Aurora." The horse's ears perked forward. There was a moment of stillness, of perfect suspension. Then, with deliberate gentleness, Aurora took the apple from Margaret's hand, the familiar gesture bringing tears to the woman's eyes. As Aurora finished the apple, she lowered her head and nuzzled Margaret's shoulder, a gesture so familiar that it caused the elderly woman to break into gentle sobs. She wrapped her arms around the horse's neck, burying her face in the golden mane that had grown wild over the years. "It's really you," she whispered, "after all this time." The wolves watched this reunion with curious eyes, neither approaching nor retreating. Rusty, the pack leader, maintained his vigilant position, amber eyes fixed on the interaction. Dr. Melissa Thompson stood transfixed, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten as she witnessed what could only be described as a miracle of recognition and connection. Earl Jackson removed his weathered hat and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect for the moment unfolding before them. "In all my years," he murmured, "I've never seen anything like this." The following days brought a flurry of activity to Cypress Haven Ranch. Dr. Thompson established a temporary research station at the edge of the clearing, careful to maintain enough distance not to disturb the delicate balance that had formed between the wolves, the horse, and now Margaret. With permission from the Mitchell family who owned the ranch, Margaret was offered accommodation in the old guest cabin, a simple but comfortable structure that had once housed visiting cattle buyers. She accepted gratefully, unwilling to be separated from Aurora after their miraculous reunion. James Miller of Bayou Network News returned with a small crew, documenting the extraordinary relationship that continued to unfold. His initial report had caught the attention of not only local viewers, but had been picked up by national networks, bringing attention to this remote corner of Louisiana. What we're witnessing defies conventional understanding of interspecies relationships, Dr. Thompson explained during an interview, her normally reserved demeanor animated by genuine excitement. These wolves have essentially adopted Aurora, providing protection, food, and companionship. It challenges everything we thought we knew about predator-prey dynamics. The footage captured by the research team's cameras told an astonishing story. At night, the wolves would form a protective circle around Aurora, taking turns keeping watch. During the day, they would guide her to areas with fresh grass and clean water. Most remarkably, they appeared to have established a communication system, subtle head movements and soft vocalizations that the horse seemed to understand and respond to. It's as if they've developed their own language, Dr. Thompson noted in her growing research journal, a unique dialect born of necessity and mutual dependence. Margaret's presence added another layer to this unusual dynamic. The wolves, initially wary of the human intrusion, gradually accepted her as an extension of Aurora. They maintained a respectful distance, but no longer retreated when she approached. On the third morning after her arrival, Margaret woke to find Rusty sitting just outside her cabin door, as if keeping watch. When she emerged, he simply gazed at her with those intelligent amber eyes before trotting off toward where Aurora grazed. "He was inviting me to follow," Margaret later told Melissa. "I know that sounds crazy, but there's no other way to describe it." Word of the extraordinary events at Cypress Haven Ranch spread rapidly. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the head of the biology department at Louisiana State University, arrived to see for herself what her colleague had been documenting. A skeptic by nature and training, she came prepared to find a logical explanation. Perhaps the wolves were simply too young to recognize the horse as potential prey, or maybe they were exhibiting some form of displaced maternal instinct. What she witnessed, however, left her scientific certainty shaken. The level of intentionality in their behavior cannot be explained by any existing behavioral model, she admitted, after observing the interactions for a full day. This appears to be a genuine case of cross-species altruism. As academic interest grew, so did public fascination. The story touched something deep in the collective imagination, a vision of harmony between species that seemed almost mythical in a world often defined by conflict. Letters and emails poured into the local news station, the university, and even to Earl Jackson himself, whose phone number had somehow found its way into the public domain. People shared their own stories of animal connections, offered donations for Aurora's care, or simply expressed gratitude for a story that brought hope in troubled times. Among those following the developments with particular interest was Richard Blackwood, CEO of Gulf Coast Development. His company had recently acquired permits to drain and develop several thousand acres of bayou land adjacent to Cypress Haven Ranch. The planned luxury resort and golf course had already faced opposition from environmental groups, but construction was scheduled to begin in less than 3 months. The sudden spotlight on the ecosystem he intended to transform represented an unexpected complication. "Find out everything you can about this situation," he instructed his assistant during a tense phone call. "I want to know who these people are and what we're dealing with." While corporate interests calculated their next moves, life at the research station settled into a rhythm. Dr. Thompson expanded her team to include graduate students eager for field experience. They established a perimeter of unobtrusive monitoring equipment, cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recorders sensitive enough to capture the softest communications between the animals, and environmental sensors tracking everything from temperature fluctuations to barometric pressure. "We need to understand the full context," she explained to her team. "What environmental factors might have influenced this unusual alliance? Is there something unique about this particular location?" The data began to tell an intriguing story. The area where Aurora had been found, and where the wolves had established their unusual guardianship, sat atop a natural spring, one of the few sources of fresh water that remained consistent through both drought and flood seasons. The surrounding vegetation was unusually diverse, offering a variety of food sources year-round. It was, in essence, an ecological oasis. Margaret spent her days divided between Aurora and assisting the research team. Her decades of experience with wildlife rehabilitation proved invaluable as she helped interpret subtle behaviors that might have escaped even trained observers. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch of the cabin, sometimes joined by Earl, sharing stories of the Louisiana Bayou from before hurricane seasons had become increasingly devastating. "This land remembers," Earl told her one evening, his voice low and thoughtful. "All the creatures that have come and gone, all the storms and calm seasons. It remembers, and sometimes it shows us something special to remind us of what matters." Margaret nodded, understanding. In her lifetime of working with animals, she had witnessed moments that defied scientific explanation, instances of intelligence, empathy, and connection that suggested a depth to animal consciousness rarely acknowledged in textbooks. "Aurora always was special," she said, watching as her horse grazed peacefully at the edge of the clearing, the wolves maintaining their now familiar positions nearby. Even as a foal, she seemed to understand things. Horses didn't, more aware somehow. "And these wolves," Earl added, "they're different too. Rusty especially. Been watching him for years now. Smarter than most people give him credit for." As darkness fell over the bayou, bringing with it the chorus of night creatures, James Miller sat in his hotel room in the nearest town, reviewing the footage his team had captured that day. Among the hours of video was a sequence that made him pause and replay it several times. Aurora, grazing alone, had suddenly raised her head, ears forward in alert. Seconds later, one of the younger wolves had emerged from the underbrush, clearly agitated. Aurora had immediately followed the wolf back into the trees. James's cameraman had rushed to follow, arriving just in time to capture what happened next. A young fawn trapped in mud at the edge of a small pond, struggling weakly. Aurora and the wolves surrounded it, and then, to the astonishment of the observers, the horse had positioned herself to provide leverage while the wolves carefully pulled the fawn free. The footage of Aurora and the wolves rescuing the fawn transformed what had been a regional curiosity into a national sensation. James Miller's report, Bayou Miracle Horse and Wolves Save Fawn, aired first on Bayou Network News before being picked up by major networks across the country. Within hours, the video had accumulated millions of views online, spawning countless discussions, analyses, and emotional responses. Dr. Thompson's phone began ringing incessantly. University colleagues, wildlife conservation organizations, and media outlets all wanted her expert perspective on the unprecedented behavior. "What we're witnessing goes beyond simple cooperation," she explained during a video interview with a prominent nature documentary producer. "This appears to be a form of complex moral reasoning, recognizing suffering in another species and taking coordinated action to alleviate it. It challenges our fundamental understanding of animal cognition." On social media, the hashtag #JagsBayouMiracle began trending nationally. Digital artists created illustrations of Aurora and her wolf companions, poets composed verses inspired by their unlikely alliance, and musicians uploaded songs dedicated to the story. A children's book author from Seattle announced plans for a picture book based on the events, with proceeds going to wildlife conservation. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with many finding hope and inspiration in the cross-species cooperation. "In a world where humans can barely get along with each other, these animals are showing us a better way," commented a popular online influencer whose post garnered hundreds of thousands of likes. At Cypress Haven Ranch, the sudden attention brought both opportunities and challenges. The Mitchell family, who had owned the property for generations, found themselves at the center of unexpected fame. Samuel Mitchell, the current patriarch, a reserved man in his 70s who had spent most of his life raising cattle and managing the land, was initially uncomfortable with the spotlight. "This land has always been for working, not for show," he grumbled to Earl. But as he witnessed the genuine wonder and respect that visitors brought to the property, his perspective began to shift. His granddaughter, Lily Mitchell, recently graduated from college with a degree in environmental science, saw potential beyond the immediate sensation. "Grandpa," she said during a family dinner at the main house, "this could be the beginning of something important. Not just for our family, but for the entire ecosystem." She outlined a vision for transforming part of the ranch into a wildlife conservation area and educational center. "People are connected to this story. They care about Aurora and the wolves. We can use that connection to help them understand the importance of preserving these wetlands. Samuel listened, his weathered face thoughtful. He had watched the bayou change over his lifetime, seen areas that had once teemed with wildlife paved over for development, witnessed the increasing intensity of storms and flooding as coastal protections eroded. Perhaps his granddaughter was right. Perhaps this unexpected event was pointing toward a new purpose for the land he had stewarded for so long. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood of Gulf Coast Development monitored the unfolding situation with growing concern. His executive team gathered in the sleek conference room of their New Orleans headquarters to assess the potential impact on their planned resort. The environmental impact study has already been approved, his project manager reminded him. We're legally clear to proceed. Legal clearance won't matter if we have protesters with cameras showing up at our construction sites, Blackwood replied, tapping his fingers irritably on the polished table. Sentiment has shifted. We need to adapt. After hours of discussion, a new strategy emerged. Rather than fighting the tide of public opinion, Gulf Coast Development would attempt to channel it. Blackwood authorized his public relations team to reach out to the Mitchell family with a modified proposal. The resort would be redesigned as an eco-luxury experience, with a significant portion of the property designated as a protected wildlife corridor. Construction would utilize sustainable practices, and a percentage of profits would be directed toward bayou conservation efforts. What Blackwood didn't reveal, even to his executive team, was that the proposed wildlife corridor conveniently bypassed the areas most suitable for petroleum exploration, a potential secondary revenue stream he had been quietly investigating. As corporate interests recalibrated, the daily research at Cypress Haven Ranch continued. Dr. Thompson and her team documented increasingly sophisticated interactions between Aurora and the wolves. They observed what appeared to be deliberate, teaching behaviors, wolves showing the horse which plants were safe to eat during the increasing drought, and Aurora using her greater height and strength to reach food sources inaccessible to her smaller companions. Most intriguing were the growing indications of what Dr. Thompson termed distributed cognition, the animals solving problems as a unified group rather than as individuals. When faced with obstacles or challenges, they would gather in a circle, exchanging soft vocalizations and subtle body language before taking coordinated action. "It's almost as if they're having a conversation," noted one of the graduate students, reviewing footage of the wolves and horse navigating a tricky section of flooded terrain, each contributing different information or suggestions. Dr. Thompson nodded, both excited and humbled by what they were witnessing. "We've always underestimated animal intelligence by measuring it against human parameters. What if cooperation rather than competition is the true measure of evolutionary success?" Margaret's connection with Aurora deepened with each passing day. Though the horse clearly maintained her bond with the wolf pack, she increasingly sought out her former owner's company, sometimes leading the wolves to the cabin at dawn, as if making formal introductions. Margaret would sit on the porch steps, speaking softly to the animals as they maintained a respectful distance, gradually growing accustomed to human presence. One morning, as Margaret shared an apple with Aurora, she noticed something tucked into the horse's mane, a small tarnished brass bell on a faded leather strap. With trembling fingers, she carefully untangled it from the golden hair. "I don't believe it," she whispered, turning the bell over in her palm. There, barely visible through years of weathering, were the initials she had engraved so long ago. A.W., Aurora Williams. The bell had been a gift for Aurora's 3rd birthday, attached to a special halter used only for special occasions. The fact that it had remained with the horse through 15 years of wilderness survival seemed nothing short of miraculous. "Dr. Thompson," Margaret called, her voice breaking with emotion, "you need to see this." The discovery of the bell added yet another layer to the already remarkable story. How had Aurora survived the devastating hurricane? Where had she been all these years? And how had she ended up in this specific section of bayou, forming an unprecedented bond with a pack of wolves? These questions captured the imagination of an increasingly invested public. Online forums buzzed with theories and speculations. Wildlife experts offered various scenarios based on known animal behavior, while others embraced more mystical interpretations of the events. A crowdfunding campaign launched by Lily Mitchell to support research and conservation at Cypress Haven Ranch exceeded its initial goal within 48 hours, drawing contributions from all 50 states and 27 countries. The academic community, initially skeptical, began to take serious notice. The prestigious Journal of Cognitive Ethology fast-tracked Dr. Thompson's preliminary paper for publication. Universities reached out with offers of research partnerships and funding. What had begun as a curious anomaly was rapidly developing into a potential paradigm shift in the understanding of animal cognition and interspecies relationships. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the bayou, James Miller prepared a follow-up documentary, interviewing not only the key figures at Cypress Haven Ranch, but also collecting perspectives from wildlife experts, indigenous knowledge, keepers and ordinary citizens moved by the story. What touches people about this story, reflected Elder Joseph Blackfeather of the local Chitimacha tribe during his interview, is that it reminds us of something we have long forgotten, that the natural world is not divided as we think. All beings are connected in ways our modern minds struggle to comprehend. In the heart of New Orleans, Margaret's grandson, Tyler Williams, watched his grandmother's transformation with a mixture of joy and amazement. A busy architectural student, he had initially worried about her sudden departure to the remote bayou. Now, during his weekend visits to Cypress Haven Ranch, he saw a woman renewed by purpose and connection. The grandmother, who had seemed to be fading after years of loss, had rediscovered her vigor, her eyes bright with the same passion that had defined her younger years working with wildlife. As October painted the bayou in rich amber and russet hues, the situation at Cypress Haven Ranch approached a crossroads. The story of Aurora and her wolf guardians had maintained its grip on the public imagination, but now tangible consequences began to materialize. Representatives from Gulf Coast Development arrived at the Mitchell family's door with their revised proposal, glossy renderings of the eco-luxury resort tucked under their arms. "We're prepared to make this a model of sustainable development," explained Vanessa Clark, the company's smooth-talking community relations director. "A portion of all proceeds would support the research being conducted here, and we'd establish a dedicated sanctuary for Aurora and the wolves." Samuel Mitchell listened with practiced patience, decades of business negotiations having taught him to hear what wasn't being said as much as what was. His granddaughter Lily sat beside him, her environmental science background allowing her to identify the carefully constructed half-truths in the proposal. "And what about the water table?" she asked, interrupting Vanessa's rehearsed presentation. "Your plans still include draining significant portions of the wetland. How will that affect the natural springs that support wildlife throughout this region?" The representatives exchanged glances before producing additional documents purporting to address these concerns. But the Mitchell family remained unconvinced. After the meeting, as they sat on the wide porch of the main house watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks, Samuel turned to his granddaughter. "What do you think, Lily? This land has been in our family for generations. I've always assumed one of you young folks would continue raising cattle here, but maybe its purpose is changing." Lily considered the question carefully, aware of the weight her grandfather placed on her answer. "I think this land has always had many purposes," she said finally. "It's sustained our family, yes, but it's also been a haven for wildlife, a filter for the watershed, a buffer against storms. The cattle operation has allowed us to maintain it rather than develop it. And that's turned out to be more important than anyone realized." Samuel nodded slowly. "Your grandmother used to say that we don't really own this land, we're just taking our turn caring for it." In the following days, word spread about Gulf Coast Development's interest in the area. Local environmental groups mobilized quickly, organizing community meetings and distributing information about the ecological importance of the bayou ecosystem. Longtime residents shared stories of how previous development projects had altered water flow patterns, exacerbating flooding in some areas while leaving others unnaturally dry. Dr. Thompson found herself thrust into the role of not just researcher, but advocate, Television interviews and community presentations became part of her daily routine as she explained in accessible terms why the intact ecosystem was essential not just for Aurora and the wolves, but for the resilience of the entire region in the face of increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. These wetlands are natural sponges, she explained during a town hall meeting in the nearby community of Whisper Creek. They absorb excess water during storms and release it slowly during dry periods. They filter pollutants from the water and provide critical habitat for countless species. Once destroyed, these functions cannot be artificially recreated, no matter how much money is invested. Margaret, once a private person content to work quietly with her beloved animals, found herself becoming an unexpected symbol of perseverance and connection. People were moved by her story of loss and reunion, by her 15-year separation from Aurora and their miraculous reconnection. When she spoke about her experiences, her soft voice somehow commanding attention, even the most development-minded listeners found themselves reconsidering their positions. Aurora survived because this land remained wild, she would say, her weathered hands gesturing to emphasize her points. She found companions and purpose in this unspoiled place. How many other miracles are happening in these wetlands that we haven't yet witnessed? And how many will never occur if we continue to prioritize concrete over conservation? Richard Blackwood, monitoring these developments from his corporate headquarters, recognized the shifting tide of public opinion. His initial strategy of co-opting the narrative was failing. It was time for a different approach. After a closed-door meeting with his executive team, Gulf Coast Development announced a community partnership initiative, offering to fund an independent environmental impact study and abide by its recommendations. "We believe in transparent, responsible development," Blackwood stated in a press release that was immediately met with skepticism from those who had been following the situation closely. What few realized was that Blackwood had already reached out to his contacts in state government, seeking to expedite certain permits that would allow preliminary work to begin before the independent study was completed. He calculated that once heavy equipment was on site and trees began falling, opposition would crumble in the face of perceived inevitability. Meanwhile, at Cypress Haven Ranch, the relationship between Aurora, the wolves, and the humans studying them continued to evolve in fascinating ways. The youngest member of the wolf pack, a female the researchers had named Ruby for her unusually reddish fur, began showing particular interest in the scientific equipment. She would observe the setting up of cameras and recording devices with evident curiosity, sometimes sitting for hours watching the researchers work. "It's almost as if she's studying us," Dr. Thompson remarked to her team one evening as they reviewed the day's observations, "trying to understand what we're doing and why we're here." Ruby's behavior exemplified what the research was increasingly revealing. These animals possessed a level of cognitive sophistication and social awareness that defied conventional understanding. The more Dr. Thompson and her team observed, the more they recognized patterns of communication, problem-solving, and even what appeared to be cultural transmission of knowledge among the wolves and between the wolves and Aurora. One rainy afternoon, as Margaret sat on the cabin porch sketching the wolves in her journal, she noticed Ruby approaching more closely than usual. The young wolf paused at the edge of the clearing, her amber eyes fixed intently on Margaret. Then, deliberately, she picked up a fallen branch in her mouth and placed it carefully on the ground before backing away a few steps. "Melissa," Margaret called softly to Dr. Thompson, who was reviewing data nearby. "I think Ruby is trying to tell us something." The two women watched as the wolf repeated the behavior, this time dragging the branch a few feet toward the denser woods before looking back at them expectantly. After a moment of hesitation, they decided to follow. Ruby led them along a winding path through increasingly thick vegetation, occasionally looking back as if to ensure they were still following. After about 15 minutes of careful progress, they emerged into a small clearing, unlike any they had seen in the area. At its center stood an ancient cypress tree of enormous proportions, its massive trunk speaking to centuries of growth. And nestled among its exposed roots was a small spring bubbling clear water into a crystalline pool. "It's beautiful," breathed Margaret, taking in the almost mystical quality of the hidden glade. But Dr. Thompson's attention had been caught by something else. Faint markings on the trunk of the great tree. Moving closer, she realized they were carvings, weathered by time but still discernible. Initials, dates, and crude symbols dating back more than a century. "This place has been special to humans for generations," she said, tracing her fingers over the marks. "And somehow, Ruby wanted us to see it." As they studied the carvings more carefully, one set of initials stood out. AW, the same as those, on Aurora's bell, accompanied by a date just weeks before Hurricane Katrina had struck. Margaret stared at the carving, memories flooding back. "I brought Aurora here," she whispered. "My husband and I used to ride in these woods sometimes. This was our special place, our secret. I had completely forgotten." She looked around with new recognition. "This is several miles from where Aurora has been staying with the wolves. She must have remembered this place after all these years, a place where she felt safe." The discovery added yet another layer to the already remarkable story. Had Aurora, fleeing the devastation of the hurricane, instinctively sought out this place of safety and peace? Had the natural spring drawn the wolves to the same location? The intersection of memory, instinct, and perhaps something more profound than either seemed to be at play. As Margaret and Dr. Thompson made their way back to the research station, guided once again by the patient Ruby, they discussed the implications of their discovery. The ancient cypress and pristine spring represented exactly the kind of irreplaceable natural treasure that would be lost if development proceeded. Yet its hidden nature had protected it thus far. Making it known might place it at greater risk. "We need to document this," Dr. Thompson said finally. "Not just for the research, but as evidence of what's at stake. This spring might be connected to the entire watershed of the region." That evening, as the research team gathered to share their findings, Earl Jackson arrived at the cabin with troubling news. "Saw survey markers being placed along the eastern boundary today," he reported, his weathered face grave. "And got word from my cousin who works for the county that Gulf Coast Development has filed for early access permits to begin clearing roads." The news of Gulf Coast Development's maneuvers galvanized the growing community of supporters that had formed around Cypress Haven Ranch. James Miller broke the story on Bayou Network News, his normally measured reporting tone edged with indignation as he detailed the company's attempts to circumvent proper environmental reviews. Environmental organizations filed emergency injunctions to halt any preliminary work. Local residents, many whose families had lived in the area for generations, organized round-the-clock monitoring of the property boundaries to report any equipment or personnel attempting to enter. At the heart of this rapidly mobilizing resistance was an unlikely alliance. The Mitchell family, Dr. Thompson and her research team, Margaret Williams, and a growing circle of concerned citizens who recognized that what was happening transcended the usual environmental disputes. This wasn't just about preserving wetlands or protecting endangered species, though those were certainly important factors. It was about acknowledging a deeper connection between all living things, a connection made visible through the extraordinary relationship between Aurora and her wolf companions. Richard Blackwood, watching his carefully crafted plans unravel in real time, called an emergency board meeting at Gulf Coast Development headquarters. "This situation has escalated beyond our projections," he admitted to the assembled executives, many of whom had already begun receiving concerned calls from shareholders. "We need to reevaluate our position." In a calculated attempt to salvage both the project and the company's public image, Blackwood authorized a press release announcing a 6-month moratorium on all development activities while a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process was undertaken. The statement, crafted by crisis management specialists, struck an appropriately conciliatory tone, but included no binding commitments beyond the temporary pause. Privately, Blackwood instructed his legal team to explore alternative approaches that might accomplish the company's goals while appearing responsive to public concerns. What he hadn't anticipated was the extent to which the story had captured the imagination of influential figures beyond the local community. A renowned documentary filmmaker reached out to James Miller, proposing a feature-length exploration of the aurora phenomenon. A popular wildlife conservation foundation announced a major grant to support the research at Cypress Haven Ranch. Perhaps most significantly, a senior senator from Louisiana, up for re-election and sensing a popular cause, scheduled a visit to the property. Senator Eleanor Beaumont had built her political career on being a moderate voice in an increasingly polarized landscape. Originally from a small town not unlike Whisper Creek, she had maintained her connections to rural Louisiana even as she navigated the corridors of power in Washington. Her arrival at Cypress Haven Ranch, accompanied by minimal staff and a notable absence of media fanfare, suggested a genuine interest rather than a mere photo opportunity. Guided by Dr. Thompson and Margaret, Senator Beaumont spent hours observing aurora and the wolves, asking thoughtful questions about their behavior and the research findings. She waded through marshy areas in borrowed boots to see the ancient cypress and sacred spring that Ruby had revealed. She listened attentively as Lily Mitchell outlined her vision for a conservation center that would balance environmental protection with educational opportunities and sustainable local employment. "What strikes me about this situation," the senator remarked as they returned to the main house for a simple lunch prepared by Earl's wife, Rose, "is that it perfectly illustrates what we keep forgetting in our policy discussions. Nature isn't a luxury or an afterthought. It's the foundation everything else depends on." Over homemade gumbo and fresh cornbread, the conversation turned to practical considerations. Senator Beaumont explained the various federal designations that might offer protection for the bayou lands, each with different implications for research, public access, and local governance. The challenge, she noted, is finding a solution that preserves what's special about this place while ensuring its stewardship remains connected to the community that understands it best. 2 days after the senator's visit, her office announced plans to introduce legislation creating the Louisiana Bayou Heritage Area, a new designation that would provide federal protection while establishing a locally led management council. The proposed boundaries encompassed not only Cypress Haven Ranch, but surrounding wetlands that formed part of the same ecological system. Equally significant was a provision for research funding specifically earmarked for continued study of interspecies communication and cooperation. Richard Blackwood recognized defeat when he saw it. With federal designation looming and public opinion firmly against development, Gulf Coast Development's board voted to divest their interests in the area, focusing instead on less controversial projects elsewhere. In a final attempt to salvage some positive publicity, Blackwood personally announced a corporate donation to the newly established Cypress Haven Conservation Trust, a gesture that was accepted with diplomatic gratitude, despite the circumstances of its offering. As autumn deepened toward winter, bringing cooler temperatures and crystal-clear skies to the bayou, the research station at Cypress Haven Ranch evolved into something more permanent. Sustainable structures designed by Tyler Williams, Margaret's grandson, began to rise at carefully selected sites that minimized disruption to the natural environment. Solar panels and rainwater collection systems ensured the human presence remained light on the land. The centerpiece of this thoughtful development was the Aurora Center for Interspecies Research and Conservation, a low-profile building whose broad windows and observation decks allowed visitors to witness the ongoing story of aurora and the wolves, while learning about the complex ecosystem that supported them. Margaret Williams, who had arrived months earlier as a solitary traveler seeking her lost companion, now found herself surrounded by an expanding family. Not just Aurora, but the researchers, students, and local community members who had been drawn together by the extraordinary events. With Senator Beaumont's legislation moving forward in Washington, she had accepted the position of community liaison for the proposed heritage area, a role that would allow her to share her unique perspective on the importance of protecting these lands. Most evenings still found her on the porch of what was now her permanent home, the simple cabin she had first stayed in. Often Aurora would graze nearby, the wolves maintaining their protective circle at a comfortable distance. Sometimes Earl would join her, bringing Rose's fresh-baked cookies or a thermos of hot coffee to share as they watched the sun sink below the cypress trees. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" he asked her one evening, as the icy first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Margaret smiled, her eyes following Aurora's graceful movements across the clearing. "Not in my wildest dreams," she admitted. "When I lost her during the hurricane, I thought that was the end of our story. I never expected a second chapter, let alone all of this." She gestured toward the research center where lights still burned, as Dr. Thompson and her team analyzed the day's observations. "It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many connections are out there waiting to be remade? How many broken things might yet be healed if we just give them the space and time they need?" The following spring brought new developments that even the researchers hadn't anticipated. Aurora, healthy and seemingly rejuvenated by her reunion with Margaret, formed an especially close bond with Ruby, the young wolf who had revealed the ancient cypress grove. The two would often wander together, sometimes disappearing for hours before returning to the main group. Dr. Thompson's team tracked these excursions carefully, documenting what appeared to be intentional journeys to specific locations throughout the protected area. They're visiting water sources, food-rich areas, and what we might call historical sites, places where human activity has left marks on the landscape, she explained during a presentation to visiting scientists. It's as if Ruby is showing Aurora a map of the territory, or perhaps Aurora is reconnecting with places she knew before. Most remarkable was the day they followed the pair to the far eastern boundary of the preserve, where construction of the Aurora Center had recently been completed. Ruby led Aurora directly to the building, approaching closer than any of the wolves had previously ventured to human structures. Together, they circled the center, pausing at each window as if inspecting the facility, before returning to the wild heart of the preserve. "They're acknowledging our presence," Margaret suggested when Dr. Thompson shared this observation, maybe even approving of it in their way. As summer approached once more, marking a full year since the discovery of Aurora and her wolf guardians, Cypress Haven Ranch prepared for a celebration. The Louisiana Bayou Heritage Area had been officially designated, with the local management council already at work developing sustainable practices that would protect the ecosystem while supporting the communities that depended on it. Representatives from universities across the country and around the world had visited to learn from the unique research being conducted. School groups regularly toured the educational facilities, young faces pressed against observation windows in wonder as they glimpsed Aurora and the wolves in their natural habitat. On the evening before the official dedication ceremony, Margaret sat alone by the spring beneath the ancient cypress, watching as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk. She heard soft footsteps approaching and turned to see Aurora making her way into the clearing, moving with the fluid grace that had returned as she regained her strength over the months. Behind her, maintaining a respectful distance, came Rusty and his pack, their red fur catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. Aurora approached Margaret and lowered her head, allowing her human companion to stroke her neck and whisper words of affection. Then, to Margaret's surprise, Rusty moved forward as well, coming closer than he ever had before. He sat just a few feet away, his amber eyes meeting hers with what seemed like deliberate communication. In that moment, Margaret felt a connection that transcended the boundaries between species, a recognition of shared purpose and mutual respect that had somehow emerged from the chaos of a hurricane, the desolation of loss, and the miracle of reunion. She understood then what Earl had meant about the land remembering, about connection.